thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon. Looks like we've got a few people out here interested in learning about blockchain. So I want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name's Alex Manders. I'm from Austin, Texas. My joke is that I heard a lot of people comment on their digital coolness with their outfit, and I truthfully have left mine at home. It consists of long hair, a beard, rock show t-shirt, and flip-flops. Now, that is the home office digital cool at my home in Austin, Texas. Among many things, I've been a management consultant for 20 years. Most recently, the past 4 years with ISG. This week, ISG will formally announce that we have or will be launching our blockchain solution service line, and I will be facilitating the global efforts with our firm around the topic of blockchain. And then finally, one more just kind of background point is that I'm also a guest lecturer at the University of Texas in Austin on the topic of blockchain. And so I'm used to having a room full of students shooting their hands in the air when they have questions about the topic of blockchain or cryptocurrency, whatever it is they are interested in talking about. So I encourage all of you to do the same. It's not going to throw me off at all if you just yell a question out or throw your hand in the air. So please do so. I would encourage it. So that said, I want to kind of jump into the presentation, assuming I can figure out a way to get this to work. Oh, now I've broken it. The big green button. All right, there we go. Okay, so I want to preference my conversation and my presentation. It's going to be a little bit different than the majority of the ones that you've seen today. So I have 5 PowerPoint slides. I'm a conversationalist in general. I like to evoke questions from the audience when we do these presentations. So what I'm going to do is walk through a business case. Earlier this year, I happened to be an interim CIO for a client of ISG's for 4 to 5 months. And so I'm going to speak to my experience as a CIO with this particular client as it related to, or continues to relate to blockchain. And when I talk about blockchain, I like to try to boil it down as basic as possible. And that is, as you can see, blockchain is a database. Now, everybody's got a different opinion about decentralization, distributed ledgers, database technology, whether it's centralized, decentralized, private, public, federated networks, etc. For the sake of this conversation, I'm going to keep it simple. We're going to think about it in terms of database. And because you are all networking professionals, I would like to encourage you again to ask me questions, or let's have a conversation about decentralized databases within the capacity of networking. So the name of this presentation is From Copper to Blockchain, and I came up with that in February of this year when I had first started to be the interim CIO for the client that I was working at. And they have infrastructure and applications that are 10, 15, 20 years old. And so we were trying to figure out how to leapfrog them with technology. And when I would say the word blockchain, the CFO would always say, I don't want any of your Bitcoin. And I'm like, no, that's not what we're talking about. So anyway, we'll get to some of the points around this business case shortly. In terms of how we're going to have a conversation, we'll think about blockchain as databases. In May of this year, let me ask a question. Has anybody ever heard of the Consensus Conference? Maybe. No one. Okay. So the Consensus Conference was held in May of this year in New York City. And at Consensus, it's proclaimed now to be the largest blockchain conference that's been held to date. There were over 10,000 people at this particular conference, everybody from the CEO and founder of FedEx to individuals from BMW and Porsche who were giving presentations on enterprise applications for blockchain, to guys with purple hair driving Lamborghinis and parking them out in front of the hotel. So there's a very wide spectrum of use cases for blockchain. The most popular known that most of you are probably familiar with is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is simply an application of a blockchain. And there are multiple blockchains that have many, many use cases and applications. But while I was at this conference at Consensus, trying to get my mind around what and how does Bitcoin or blockchain relate to networking, I at least wanted to call out a few of the key things and trends that I've seen over the past few months and then also from the conference. Those being that, as again I've mentioned, blockchain being a public or a private or a federated network, this is kind of, it doesn't need to be any more complicated. As a public network, such as Ethereum or the World Wide Web, think of it this way, or a private blockchain network, think of it as kind of your in-house IBM solution or Oracle solution, SAP, so this is private to you as an enterprise, and then also federated. So what's going on is we have big industry consortiums being formed, for example, insurance and banking. What these competitors traditionally have done is bonded themselves together to create hybrid blockchain applications and blockchains themselves. So R3 Cordia, for example, they happen to be, it includes like the Bank Santander, JP Morgan Chase, and some other big banks. And so they're building their own. So it's not too much more difficult than that to understand. But from a networking perspective, because that is what we're here to talk about, there are emerging applications of managing the network appliances, such as the switches, the firewalls, and the routers. Cisco has come out with a couple of use case studies on this. I know there was someone from Cisco earlier. I'm not sure if they're in the crowd or not. But Cisco has started to embed blockchain technology into some of its hardware devices in order to track and measure and monitor access. So who's using it, when are they using it, using smart contracting mechanisms, which is a blockchain application to prevent users from getting into the networks and things of that nature. And then finally, the idea of blockchain using it as a platform for the Internet of Things as a gateway. And I think the Sprint presentation earlier today was very good when he was talking about IoT and how you secure IoT applications, the enterprise use cases, things of that nature. So again, just some of the emerging applications of blockchain related to networking that I have seen based on a couple of years of research now. So let me just pause and just ask, does anybody have any other blockchain-related networking use cases that they are working on or they have read about or otherwise conceptualized? No. Okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll move into something a little bit more So if I understand our preference to that question, it's kind of how big can a blockchain get?
Yes. And does your network have to continue to expand to handle that capability of that blockchain moving from point A to point B?
So blockchains, at least the way I understand it, and somebody can correct me or challenge me on this, but a blockchain, the technology itself is a decentralized ledger, is infinite. That means the Ethereum network is the largest public computer in the world today. So Ethereum is a public blockchain. Some of you may have heard of it. It runs with an ERC20 token. That's how a lot of these ICOs and cryptocurrencies, startups that you've heard of, basically the reinvention of the 1990s with startups and IPOs in Silicon Valley, that kind of stuff is all occurring on the Ethereum public network, and that it would be an infinite set of blockchain technology with applications being built on top of it. Now, the challenge is trying to create what they call interoperability standards so that you can take the Ethereum network and bridge it to another blockchain, right? So the issue is there's a lot of blockchains. People start to think about blockchain and they think it's like one blockchain or two blockchains. It's actually, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And the problem, or one of the big challenges, is trying to figure out how do we get them all to work together. So if you have a value chain, in this example, within the elevator industry, when I built this software application that ran on blockchain, I could have used IBM Hyperledger or Ethereum, any kind of blockchain platform that I wanted to, by using it for different functionalities, but I couldn't really put them together yet. So I couldn't use one function from smart contract on Ethereum and then try to marry it over here with something from Hyperledger. So I'm not sure if that answered the question or not, but it's infinite, short answer.
It kind of answered the question, then it opened up a whole series of just trying to understand how this is all going to play together and work.
Sure. So I tell you what, let me keep going through these slides, and then when the panel comes up, we have 4 panelists, and we're going to have a conversation on how to tie this together and maybe readdress the question. Does that work?
That works great. Thanks.
All right. Very good. Okay. So while I was in business school, I learned the easiest way for me is to explain with actual business use cases. So what I wanted to do is spend the next 13 minutes talking about the business case that we developed for a client of ISG's. So how many people, and I know that there's got to be at least one hand that goes up when I ask this question, how many people have ridden on an elevator today? Good. So while we have at least some people that have ridden the elevator. Okay, so the client that I was an interim CIO at happened to be in the elevator manufacturing business. So they manufacture components for elevators. When we started our work with them, they hadn't upgraded any of their technology in a long time. We'll kind of keep it simple. Instead of me coming in and trying to explain to them what blockchain was, I started by asking, what are your business challenges? What are you trying to do? And they were trying to grow through acquisition, and they were trying to better serve their customers. And so I said, well, what are the challenges with serving your customers? So by way of learning, I discovered that the primary customer of this elevator component manufacturing firm was the service technician. So the individual that would buy the part and actually install it into an elevator, or when an elevator broke, they would order another part from this company and go and install it, right? The problem is that every time a service technician would call in, they struggled to find the part, or the service technician wouldn't be notified of a part failure within an elevator for hours or days. So does anybody in here live in a condominium building? I know there's at least one. You don't like walking up and down those stairs when your elevator breaks in the middle of the winter with your dog, do you? That's right. No one likes walking up and down the stairs, regardless of if you're in a hotel, an office building, your resident, doesn't matter. So what the challenge was is, how do we better communicate with the field or the service technicians in order to get them parts? And better yet, those service technicians are very expensive. They're one of the most expensive unions in the United States. So every time a service technician goes to an elevator, it's a very expensive bill. They got to go look at it, they have to diagnose it, and they have to figure out what the part is, where the part was manufactured. And some of these parts last forever, 60, 70, 80, 90 years in some cases. So the challenge that I wanted to solve with blockchain was, how do we better communicate with the field service technicians when an elevator breaks? Very easy. So what we did before we even started architecting a solution was we built a technical solution architecture. And this probably is oversimplistic for many of you in the crowd. I do understand that. But the individual I was working with, I said, look, we have our business problem. We want to reduce labor costs, increase operational margins, increase repair time to elevators. If the elevator at Yankee Stadium fails, we want to know it. We want to make sure people are safe, and we want to get parts into the field as fast as possible. That's our business challenge. So before we even start talking to these guys about blockchain, let's make sure we got our business and our strategy mapped out. Then the second step was that we built the application outline. So we didn't go out and start calling service providers. We didn't go out and start asking IBM or Hyperledger, what can you guys do to help us build a blockchain application? Instead, we said, hey, look, if we break down data within this value stream or this process, we have data that can be produced, processed, logged, transferred, hosted, stored, and used. So those were our kind of data buckets. How's this data getting out of an elevator? How are we going to do anything with it to resolve the business case? And so in the middle here, you can see elevator, computer controller, controller software or server software, Amazon Web Services, IoT, Hyperledger, blockchain, and Twilio. Now, I want to spend a minute and just walk through that, because this is the key of this particular application. We started with the elevator itself, something that we all take for granted every day. It's a very overly, we use it, but we don't really think about its importance until it breaks. So within the elevator, behind that little button that you push is a computer. With the exception of these ones up here, it's called destination dispatch. Those are the ones that you tap your floor in, and then they come down and then pick you up and take you to the floor. That's for a security reason. But the computer controller behind the buttons has a server on it, and typically there's software that's interfacing with that server. What we did was we tied the software from the server, essentially making that computer or that elevator a smart connected device. And when we made it a smart connected device, we put it on Amazon Web Services IoT. So AWS IoT platform, you can digitize pretty much anything, and that you're as creative as you can be. And we've digitized our computer or our elevator, put it on IoT, and then the only piece of blockchain that we used was the Hyperledger Sawtooth piece. That's it. So our entire architectural design, we used one piece of blockchain. That was it. We didn't build a blockchain. We didn't build a huge blockchain application. We used a piece of an existing technology. In this case, it came from the IBM Walmart supply chain open source code. And I think some of you probably saw this morning in the Wall Street Journal, where Walmart just announced that it's going to make all the people in its supply chain that have lettuce, they have to log the lettuce onto their food supply chain. So big news. But anyway, we just pulled that code and we baked it into our product. And then Twilio, which is a communication messaging service, we just put that in the top layer. Because what I wanted to do is figure out how do we get, this is my example, when the elevator breaks in Yankee Stadium, how do I notify 4 people at once? And so the person that made the part, what the part, or the building owner, where the part came from the manufacturer, and then the service technician company, and then the service technician that was closest to Yankee Stadium to repair that part. So I used the Twilio agent with some third-party APIs. Twilio is just basically an SMS text messaging system. So what did we ultimately do? We built a proof of concept in 10 weeks. I used an intern from the University of Texas who was 19 years old, and according to some studies, less than 2% of Fortune 100 CIOs claim to have blockchain applications. Other studies say that 90% of Fortune 100 companies have some type of proof of concept. And my intern and I, we did this for an elevator manufacturing company that has infrastructure that's 20 years old. We did it for them in 10 weeks to prove out a minimum viable product. Because my whole goal with this exercise was to prove to this particular client that there is value to be had with using blockchain technology that's not financial in nature. A lot of the applications of blockchain today, they have conversations around finance and accounting, back office functions, increasing operational margins by displacing intermediaries. They're doing manual reconciliations with medical records, right? So I've tried to get away from that and just say, look, we can track a part that you manufacture when it goes out the door, supply chain and logistics. We can track its movement in a blockchain, which we did. And then when that elevator breaks, and every fault code that occurs in the life of that elevator, it'll be logged in an immutable ledger, which is important because it's an audit log. So now we know this building, for example, I would know by looking at the application that we built, who installed the parts, when they were installed, how many times they broke, who repaired them, all in an immutable ledger, and I could troubleshoot that remote. So using Wi-Fi or cable access, I can come right into the elevator controller and begin to self-diagnose or diagnose what the issues are. That reduces my service technician trip, which reduces my labor. I've collected data on the backside to drive predictive analytics so that I can begin to create smart products. So this company makes more than just the buttons or the computer behind the buttons. They make all kinds of stuff. So with that kind of a data asset being logged in an immutable ledger, they've got a new piece of technology that they could otherwise license. They've created multiple value opportunities across the value chain. And they're still trying to figure out how this intersects with IoT, which we also help them do. This particular client, they wanted to know how smart connected devices fit into their network and how those devices could ultimately create value for their clients. And with this particular study, we showed that 43% of the IoT use cases that they were interested in implementing in their manufacturing business could be supported by this software application. So again, transaction processing from a supply chain movement perspective, and then also reconciled back to anytime something breaks in that elevator. So now it's the idea of making this an elevator that could effectively communicate with other parts within the elevator itself, so it truly becomes smart in nature, which kind of scares me a little bit when I think about an artificial intelligent computer or elevator. But anyway, that's kind of what we came up with. So ultimately, when an elevator would break at Yankee Stadium, for example, an automatic message would be sent to 4 people at one time. We can tie it back to the provenance of the lot for that part that got shipped because you're tracking all the information within the distributed ledger. And it's a dashboard that can be accessed by, pretty much the people that you want within the business. So again, I kind of talked about this idea of IoT and how do we digitize other components in the manufacturing space. I know that the speaker on Sprint, he was talking about IoT as well, where my team and I, or my intern and I, we decided that we wanted to digitize all the parts in this elevator company. And what we determined or discovered was that they actually make their own computer chips for their elevators. So again, the button or the computer behind the button. And I said, well, why don't you just start to engineer more chips that you could put on other parts of your, other parts that you sell into the elevator business, and then start to digitize all these parts. So now we have a digitized door operator, a digitized controller, digitized ropes and pulley systems, and you're collecting all this data. And the goal is that when you collect all this data, you start to create new services and products that are smart in nature. So again, this is just a little bit behind the scenes of what we're trying to get them. And the benefit, again, is, or blockchain in this case, is that it is serving as that IoT gateway. It's a software, and the data that it's collecting is very secure, just by nature of cryptography and the way that it's logged within Hyperledger. By way of background, Hyperledger is endorsed by the Linux Foundation, so IBM and Linux. Hyperledger is backed by the Linux Foundation, and it has a lot of developer tools. It's got a huge community, and so that was part of our rationale behind using Hyperledger and R3, or actually, it wasn't R3. We used Hyperledger because of the Sawtooth fabric, And the reason that's important is because it relies on a concept called proof of elapsed time, POET, and that's where we started to bring in code to do time tracking. So that said, I nailed it on 3 zeros, which I've never done. I believe we have 5 minutes for Q&A before I bring up the panelists, or I could actually just ask the panelists to come up now, and then we could facilitate any questions or answers. Or I guess, yeah, I would have to ask you a question in order to get an answer, but does anybody have any questions, comments while the panelists come up to the stage? I've either really bored you or I've really confused you, or a combination of both. Normally when I ask that to the students, they're falling over each other to try to ask me a question about cryptocurrency.
Hello? 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 Okay. That was a great case study, and I guess what was the aftermath of it? I don't know how long ago that was, but I would think that manufacturer took notice, and he probably opened up a whole new department for them.
Well, you would think that they would fall all over themselves to do this, but they're going through some other technology upgrades. So I literally just delivered this last month. It was like mid-August, so we're in mid-September. So I've only had it for about 4 weeks. And it's resonating with the C-suite because I had to spend a lot of time. This was not easy. You know, when you're talking to a CFO and every time you say blockchain, he's teasing you about, Aeon or Icon coins or trading Bitcoin or shorting the CME for some sort of futures exchange on a contract around Bitcoin, right? So it took me, I was kind of the redheaded stepchild a little bit because I had to explain and re-explain and gain their confidence that what I was talking about was correct. So my hope is that they do move forward with implementing a functioning proof of concept or prototype because they have it. And they're very fortunate to have it. And we are going to talk to them about starting something in January. It's kind of funny because I don't quite think they understand what they have yet. But they will. Any other questions? Okay, all right. So we can move into the panel. We have 4 esteemed panelists who have traveled in from all over the United States today to talk with us about automation, blockchain, and SD-WAN, which SD-WAN has just monopolized the conversation today, so hopefully we can all have a conversation on that. So we'll start with Mike Cromwell. Then we have Charisse Mayhorn, Paul Paz, and Stephen Tepler. And you guys all sat in order, which is fantastic.
Wow, that was by accident.
Are you sure?
It's a blockchain.
Blockchain. We set up a smart contract. No, I won't tell a joke quite like that. Okay, so let me just sit down here. While I'm opening my computer, why don't we just go around real quick and maybe try to explain to the crowd what you think blockchain is in as few words as possible.
As few words as possible.
Yeah.
First thing that comes to mind is the first article that I read and posted on LinkedIn. It got an astonishing number of views. And it was I think it's probably about 18 months ago. And it was called, the title of the article was WTF is Blockchain. Good article, actually, for those that want to get caught up to speed. But one of the most logical ways for me to think about it is having grown up in the network service provider business. Think back to the early days of understanding data networks and transport. And I love analogies. And if you think about the old packet-based networks, frame relay and PLS, and you think about IP packets and headers, and equate that to the U.S. mail, data inside the envelope going from point A to point B, similar to the way a data packet traverses. And I would have likened blockchain to a FedEx on steroids, because with blockchain, you've got the ability to not only have a fingerprint of everything that's happened along the way, accumulation of data, but the ability to set policy, permissions throughout the workflow, and its ability to conduct a transaction with more security, with less middlemen, and theoretically faster and more efficient than anything we have in place today.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Cherise, how about yourself?
A more animated perspective, but my thoughts always with blockchain goes to kind of a conga line. You've got, yeah, I validate you, and the validation keeps going, and I kind of like that visual is what comes to me with blockchain.
Very nice. Paul?
Yeah, well, I thought it was pretty interesting, the zero trust discussion that was up. When you hear a lot of people talk about blockchain, their perception of it is that it redefines trust, right? Because you're now enabling multiple different business. When you went through that IoT example, what it does is it enables multiple businesses to have the trust to act as one business. So you're really redefining the business process by having a level of trust between different businesses. That's kind of what it means to me.
Fantastic. How about you, Stephen?
Blockchain means a few different things to me. One is it's about provenance, but provenance of what? It's also a matter, and when I mean provenance, I mean is something what it purports to be at the time something happened. So it's both time and event focused, but also when it comes to trust, this is digital certificates on steroids, and we're going to have a heck of a time managing trust, however you want to define that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. So let's start with Michael, first question. So you've got an extensive background in sourcing, network provider side, things of that nature. How do you, based on your understanding of blockchain, see it impacting a blockchain conversation around networking 12 to 18 months from now?
Good question. So, to me, I love what you said about where the development of applications around blockchain start with solving a problem. And if you think about the problems that exist combined with the market trends that are taking place right in front of our eyes, digital transformations moving across the enterprise at warp speed, network service providers are, everything's getting decentralized. If you look at the IT environment at most companies today, there's an increasing number of vendors, suppliers. The network is being increasingly decentralized to thousands of IoT devices, mobility, et cetera. And if you look at the traditional network model with its hardware-based, silo-based, as you move to the decentralization of the network, it opens up all kinds of risk for the enterprise and for service providers. It's the cybersecurity threats through any of those endpoints is huge. The complexity of managing it for both the enterprise and for the service provider is huge. You look at the service provider today that's got to work with all these different third-party service providers, cloud providers. It introduces a whole nother level of complexity to get things done. So as you move forward, enterprises want to move faster. They want more control. They want to be able to set policy, mitigate risks, and develop new applications, and the network's got to be the catalyst for that. And so to me, blockchain represents the ability to have more control over IoT, artificial intelligence throughout the network. One of the things that's fascinating to me is networks. You look at the architecture of most network service providers today, many of them are still operating in silos, and the bigger they are, the more silos there are. And so with blockchain, you've got the ability now to define policy, empower the user, empower vendors, third parties that you must integrate with, and really it allows control of everything from the sales process all the way through through the workflow. Because just like you talked about automating a process in an elevator, the more you can automate those steps along the way from the service provider's perspective, from the design of the solution through to the proposal, to the contract, to the implementation, to the onboarding, that process is insanely complex from the service provider perspective, traversing lots of different systems, lots of swivel chairs historically. And with blockchain, the capabilities of blockchain to develop applications that have control, security, lifecycle policy, and allow you to have an inventory of what's transpired, and be able to look at the digital fingerprint that's left behind. I think there's fascinating implications for blockchain as it relates to the applications in the network environment. And it's all about, at the end of the day, all network service providers are serving clients. And to me, it's about improving the client experience. And we all know how challenging that's historically been in the past. So it's going to help the service providers serve their clients better. But to those that are with enterprises here today, I think that the impact to you is going to be ultimately more control, ability to be fully empowered to run your network and get things done quicker, and more visibility and more security.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Paul, to build off of Mike's comments, when we caught up last week, you mentioned some of the conversations you were having with your clients, and this idea of many networks, many blockchains, many sets of infrastructure, many one-to-many and many-to-many communications across all these different things. So what is it you're hearing, and what should the crowd be aware of 12 to 18 months from now in terms of blockchains, communications, et cetera?
Yeah, I think, well, for Vodafone anyway, IoT is a big part of a lot of the conversations we're having with enterprises today. Right? So we're already having blockchain conversations with them and making that part of the food chain. We've got already up and running 60 million connections between machines, right, as a company. So securing those is certainly a topic of discussion that we have with a lot of enterprise clients today. I think ultimately it won't come from the IT side. It's going to come from the business side. People are going to re-engineer, I think, the business applications, people who are in the elevator business, people who are in smart buildings, coolers, farm equipment, all these other things that are leveraging technology in new ways are going to latch on to blockchain. And it's going to become an integral part of whatever that strategy is. And service providers are going to have to facilitate that. They're going to have to understand how implementing blockchain as part of that solution is going to impact those clients from a security perspective, from a network capacity perspective. You asked a question before about how many, I mean, the best thing about blockchain is that it's in so many different places at the same time, you can't break it. That's what makes it immutable, right? But it does mean that you're constantly updating records within that blockchain. How far does that blockchain go? Who are all the people and all the networks that have to make that blockchain work? Who's going to write to that record and take an active part in that blockchain? So that's going to be the basis for a lot of the discussions. And how are we as service providers and you as enterprise clients going to create that blockchain of trust between your businesses and make that work when you all own and operate separate networks and separate infrastructures? And then parts of that will also be in the cloud. So they're all going to be in Microsoft Azure or AWS, right? So records are going to be in there as well. So all of this stuff is creating a flow of information that's going to eat capacity in the networks. So I think it's going to be a really interesting and challenging conversation for sure as the business drives the need, because I think that's exactly where it's going to come from.
Wonderful. I'd like to kind of take the next question, go to Sharice. Sharice, with Discovery Network Architect. On Friday when we were talking, you brought up a fabulous concept that I hadn't heard of yet, Ledger as a Service, so LAAS. Then you also spoke to how blockchain could make mobility easier. So wondering if you could comment on both your perspective with Ledger as a service and then how blockchain could otherwise make mobility easier based on your experience?
Yeah, from an enterprise perspective, I think Ledger as a service would be attractive on both, we'll say, a public and a private level. On the public level, my people, places, and things and processes are global. Having some sort of infrastructure as a service, Ledger as a service that's run by someone other than myself is very appealing. I don't have to recreate the wheel of Ledger in-house. And on the private level, private defined however that's relevant to you, whether it's data center hub, global area, EMEA, Americas, or it's maybe a zone behind a firewall, wherever you need to have kind of a localized service, then also Ledger as a service locally that might be run in conjunction with a public service. And then as a network architect, identity and TACAX alternatives, kind of those sort of thoughts are floating in my head of more of a private application of Ledger as a service. Can I use blockchain to validate my process as my processes or my host or my VM, whatever, is moving around because it's moving in my virtual environment, it's going from on-prem to cloud, between cloud, what have you. How can I ensure that I can trust its validity, and then as it's participating in processes and communications, how can I validate that it is who it is after it's moved?
Fantastic. All right, Stephen, question for you. We had on our conversation last week, I was pretty interested to learn more about your background. You mentioned you have 6 patents on blockchain-related technologies. You've got a background with startups. You're currently the privacy and security chair for your law firm. So from a technical perspective, you could probably give a lecture. I'm curious to know, from a standards, interoperability perspective, authentication, what are things that if folks in the room decide to go down this blockchain path, what should they be aware of?
Blockchain has an incredible promise, but much like federated PKI, which died in the vine and probably should not have, it is something that has to focus on trust. So if I have a blockchain, I start a blockchain, I'm in an enterprise, whose certificate am I going to use? Am I going to use a self-signed certificate for, I'm XYZ company? Oh, sure, I'll use my XYZ certificate that I will create. Or am I going to get it from some other certification authority? What happens if there's a compromise of that certification authority at the initialization vector, at that first block? What does that do to the rest of the blockchain? So there are trust issues that, while the promise is there, you also have to look at, are we going to have a lot of worms out there like flying around? Or are we going to federate these blockchains and maybe have forks that come out of them? And if so, who manages ultimately that trust model? And a trust model has to be built. And right now, ISO, the International Standards Organization, has spun up a blockchain security, and it's coming up under SE 27, I believe, Security Consortium. So it's a security standard for blockchain, and there are some other associated blockchain standards in the offing. But we're still at the very, very beginning. And I think that you'll see a movement towards an agreement, and it has to be an international agreement because we're not talking just the United States here. So, once we get past the issues of trust and anchors and roots and how we're going to deal with this plethora of different types of, different origins of blockchain, I think we'll be moving pretty quickly towards adoption.
Does anybody have anything to comment on Stevens before I ask the next
I'm a lawyer.
question?
You can throw tomatoes
Well, I
anytime you
know.
want.
No, it's interesting because when you look at not only where the chain goes, but the information that's in the chain. In some cases, that could be personal data, as an example. With GDPR, where is it all going to get stored? Is it legal to store it somewhere other than where it shouldn't be?
Well, but
right?
as a result, in most blockchains, the beauty of blockchain is that you don't have the content. You refer to the content.
Right.
It's a mega associative capability which extends, I'm dancing with my hands, which extends over time.
Right.
And I think that's the beauty of it. So you as John Doe from Europe could carry your blockchain of your medical information,
So your
and the
digital
only
avatar.
thing that would be on that blockchain would be where to go to find information, not who provided it to you necessarily, not what was done, not what was paid. And this is the very thing that GDPR especially is concentrating on.
Right.
So
But
from
I think you brought up a good point, and that's at this stage it's specific to network service providers. It's in its infantile stage. I can't think of anybody that's really deployed it, but I can think of lots of use cases.
Massive use case.
Massive. I mean,
Massive
I can
use
tell
cases
you
for it.
firsthand, and having run a service provider, started a cloud business. The use cases are all over the place. The challenge is going to be, gaining adoption and gaining an ecosystem of relevant providers. And so it's like anything else when it starts off, how do standards get created? And although it's not a standard, blockchain is a standard. It's an ecosystem of people who are organizations who are participants. And there has to be certain, has to be relevant for the members. And I think the more relevancy you gain, the more it gains adoption. But the use cases, they're all over the place.
And I think
From
enterprises are
my
very
clients,
open.
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think enterprises are ready and open and just waiting for that ecosystem to be developed.
And my clients are looking at this, and my sense from my clients, from a cybersecurity perspective, and I think there are huge applications for it, is it allows for you to create a model and a system and a business process where your client can demonstrate defensible mechanisms, policies, and processes that were in place at the time of any particular claimed incident, pre or post. And with that, you'll be able to document and record, whether it be for civil litigation, shareholder litigation, or for regulatory investigations. It makes things so much easier to be able to say, here it is, I can't, it's verifiable. The information is what it purports to be. As a lawyer, I want to know that the information is what it purports to be at the time I assert its relevance. And that's where the critical difference in blockchain and any other audit mechanism comes into play.
So I want to reposition a different question here. So myself, over the past several years, have been studying blockchain. Way back a couple years ago, I decided that if I ever wanted to be a blockchain expert, I had to build technology. I think I told you guys this. My wife and I, we started building mining machines, cryptocurrency miners, et cetera. Kind of geeked out, right? And so, but the point of that was that I'm able to effectively communicate on both a private hobby level to an enterprise level on what blockchain is. And it's difficult. It's not easy. Like, I guarantee probably, hopefully 100% of you understood something that I said or took some value away from that, but it's a difficult topic to explain. So that said, what is or are the reasons why blockchain is slow to be adopted? And Charisse, we'll start with you.
I think partly, as we've alluded, an ecosystem starting it off, I have many use cases where I want to apply it. I just need a solution to be provided to me in a box, which is kind of embarrassing to say in this kind of environment that we have of open source and building yourself, et cetera. But when it comes to a large enterprise or even a smaller, medium-sized business, on some level it needs to be packaged for us. So I think we're waiting for that. But we're pretty excited about change management, process management, like I said, identity. There are so many areas that we'd like to apply this.
Okay, great. Paul, how about you?
I think it's scary for some people. I think that blockchain is going to cause some real industry restructuring in terms of how we leverage banks, how we leverage other institutions that we traditionally relied on for creating that certificate of trust, right? I think to your point before that it's going to change quite a few things, and it's scary to some people. I think that like any new technology, there are standards that have to be created. There are rules and regulations that have to be created to understand how we're going to leverage these things. There is certainly no shortage of people investing in it. I know Vodafone has made some significant investments in it. We're working with lots of other partners, some big companies that have hired over 1,000 people and spent a couple $100 million on blockchain. So it's definitely coming. It might be a little bit slow in getting here, but I think to your point, I think it was created out of Bitcoin, which confused the heck out of people as well. They thought it was this financial mechanism. It really had nothing to do with any other part of the industry. And now it's just being realized that, well, no, it's a conceptual trust and security mechanism that you can leverage across a whole bunch of other things.
That's right.
Right. So, and they're just starting to figure out what all those possibilities are.
Wonderful. Stephen, how about you?
I think on the one hand, you have the Gartner hype cycle, rush for VC investment problems and solutions in search of problems issue that we saw 20 years ago with the explosion, the Silicon Valley's explosion then. But on the other hand, I just recently heard that IBM has an incredibly huge blockchain effort undertaking right now, and I think Microsoft does as well. And once these players really start moving on it, I think that the validity and the credibility of the theory and the applications become much more easy. I think you'll see it become adopted much more quickly. It's accelerating as we speak.
Wonderful. Thank you. Michael.
I tell you, I agree. It's coming. It is absolutely going to be coming, and it may be slow to initially adopt. But if you look at how things are moving in market, you look back at the last half a dozen hype cycle curves. Things are moving faster, a lot faster. And if you look at what's stacked up on the left side of the curve on the most recent one that came out a couple months ago, never seen so much stacked up on the left side. And I think blockchain just moved past the peak of inflated expectations. And I think that whenever you just look at disruption. Disruption's driven at warp speed when problems and use cases intersect. And right now, you look at the risks that are present by not having blockchain, especially if you look at the number of distributed devices throughout the network. The risks are unbelievable. And that's the number one risk cited by the federal government today is risk through IoT devices into the power grid, right? So these things have to be solved. And I think the market's asking for it. The applications are absolutely there. And I think that recent adoption is accelerating. So when the use cases are there, and you're right, there's a lot of money flowing into it.
Yeah.
A lot of money flowing into it. So there's a lot of smart people figuring it out right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to all of your points and comments, like you mentioned Microsoft, I believe. So you've got Microsoft coming in with blockchain as a service, SAP, Oracle, all the majors. I mean, we've done some research in ISG, 20 to 25 incumbent service providers are offering blockchain services and use cases. And my question for you all, with your networking backgrounds and understanding of blockchain, is what we've seen before from a disruption perspective is you got small emerging companies popping up and start to displace the large incumbents. I guess, what is your perspective on that idea with blockchain? Because it's very much a technology that maybe the five of us just started a company and we do something. Do you see them being a threat to your business, or?
I got interesting insight on that one firsthand.
Okay.
So I was head of sales at a $1.5 billion service provider for 4 years, and got firsthand knowledge of the systems, the architecture of the network, a lot of our pain points and servicing clients. And before I made the next move, studied the landscape and went to work for a company that was starting a UC business from scratch, and had the opportunity to go in and write the business plan. We had access to a team of developers in India. We built our own OSS, BSS, all of our own customer-facing portals. Long story short, from the time I started to the time we sold our first deal was probably 4.5 months. And within a year, we were competing against the biggest names in UC and taking business from the biggest service providers. So it is way easier to start. Well, one, it's way easier to build a platform portals in a greenfield environment than it is to try to cobble together legacy systems. So we had that advantage for us. The second thing is, cost to launch any software business today, the barriers have gone down so much that companies can come out of nowhere. If they've got a great idea and they've got a great application, great use case, and there's a market that they serve a pain point, massive disruption. So I think at this point, legacy providers are going to, the larger providers know a lot of them very well. They got to think like, they got to innovate faster. They got to be more nimble, because if they don't keep up with what the market's demanding, they're going to lose share fast.
Wonderful. Paul, what do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, the first 10, 15 years of my career was in startups, and a lot of the innovation comes from there. You're going to see them pop up everywhere, I think. I think probably a blockchain engineer is probably going to be the hottest job on the market for the foreseeable future. I think that you'll see them, and then they'll drive innovation, and some of them will disappear, some of them will grow big. It will depend. I mean, you saw the same thing with SD-WAN, right? I mean, VMware sucked up VeloCloud, right? Those companies start up, they get to a certain point, and there's a tipping point for startups, right? They get to that point where either they're going to go from 30 or 50 million to 200, or they're just going to get sucked into a bigger framework. But they are definitely the ones that push the envelope, because they can act much quicker than larger companies, and don't have a lot of bureaucracy to slow them down.
And so based on Mike and Paul's comments on the startups, what do you, based on your experience, believe, Stephen, the crowd should be aware of, just in terms of people coming into the market with new technology that could displace them? Because you've got a background with startups as well.
I typically attend the RSA Security Conference every year. I present. I'm co-chair of the ABA's Information Security Committee, and we have a track on information security in the law. I will tell you that it was a very quick adoption for the security industry to start offering blockchain-enabled applications and suites. Compare that with Sarbanes-Oxley back in 2004 or 5, when it took about 2 years for all of a sudden the security types to say, well, here's how you can achieve compliance, which was kind of an iffy proposition to begin with. But the speed with which blockchain has emerged onto the scene pretty much convinces me that it's not soup du jour.
Very good. Wonderful. So we have landed on triple zeros again. Check that out. I believe, does that mean we have a few minutes for questions then? 4 minutes for questions. Any questions? Those lights are right in my face. No questions. Okay.
Over there.
I see one.
2.
In the back.
Brad.
Thanks, Maria. So the comments were made earlier about it's coming. Blockchain's coming, albeit very slowly. I'm hoping that each of the panelists can give me a couple of kind of the most immediate examples of what we should look for as far as the practical applications that we might see for the network, both from a carrier network perspective and maybe from an enterprise network perspective. Again, don't need to have the whole range of things, but just kind of what should we be telling our clients to look for as some of the initial practical applications that they could expect?
I'll take a run at that. I think of a couple of things on the service provider space. I think the ability to manage the different network elements, because as you get into software-based network control and orchestration of different network elements. So if you put an SD-WAN network in, and now you've got let's say if you move away from the incumbent and now you've got a SD-WAN layer, and then you've got connectivity solutions from ranging anywhere from fiber to broadband to 4 or 5G, you've introduced all these players that you now have to manage, right? So doing moves, adds, control, or moves, adds, changes, scaling up, scaling down. In today's environment, that is a administrative and process nightmare for most providers. In the future world, if blockchain's applied to that, then you establish a set of rules up front and enable either partners within the ecosystem to make changes, or customers to make changes. You're now taking lots of middlemen out of the equation, and in the process, eliminating swivel chair, human error, potential intervention, and you've got a record of exactly what happened and the ability to set the policy. So that's one, and I can tell you, having been a UC provider, that we were in the BroadSoft ecosystem. So we had our own OSS, BSS, our own portals, so we enabled that control to the client. But then in the BroadSoft ecosystem, you've got all these third-party providers that you integrate into, hundreds, right? And I can think of blockchain as a great use case in the BroadSoft ecosystem as an example for inventory management of licenses, ordering of license, interaction amongst the providers. Today, it's a very manual, time-intensive process, a nightmare to track.
I would say from the enterprise perspective, the easiest applications are change management, asset management. It doesn't even have to be the front end. It could be the back end for ServiceNow, et cetera. Changing basically the back end database for existing processes to give a little more security and immutability to the information that you're tracking.
Wonderful. Paul?
Yeah, I would tell them to be on the lookout for product and service offerings from service providers that are going to enable blockchain or leverage blockchain. I know, as I said before, our own company are working on solutions that would leverage blockchain into some of the IoT initiatives that we have for clients. So when they're looking to leverage a service from a service provider or an integrator, they would want to understand how blockchain is being leveraged into that to gain efficiencies and reduce costs. And then I know we'll use it internally. I think every enterprise is going to use it internally, right? There are ways to leverage blockchain. I mean, think about a world where you're not building a fence around the information. The protection is built into the information, right? It's a lot less expensive once you look at it from that perspective, and how you're going to leverage, how we're going to leverage blockchain across that whole IDLE stack, right? Of service management, change management, request management, all those different things that go into how we leverage services for clients. So you'll see it on both ends, I think. I think you'll see it in services that providers are going to offer to enterprises, maybe Ledger as a service, right, that will come out. We're working on some stuff with supply chain and also some stuff with IoT, so you'll definitely see it coming soon.
So I'm looking at utilities. And utilities, I'm not only looking at power systems, but also healthcare systems, which have so many different moving parts and so many disparate moving parts that this would be kind of this would be like the blood that would circulate throughout each of these systems, be able to tie it together. So I think that healthcare systems, from a granular perspective, and utilities in general, think municipal utility systems also, have probably the greatest application right now.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. So do we have any more time, Maria? Or?
I think someone over here. Oh.
Well, we'll take another question and then cut the break a little shorter.
I'm encouraged by the broad use of end cases, but as a longtime CIO, the attractiveness to me initially, and I think will continue to be, in leveraging finance. We were a $10 billion company that bought $8 billion of stuff. So just the arbitrage on $18 billion of goods and services through a smart contract, taking the banks out of the middle, or changing the relationship with the banks in the middle, and the whole risk profile of that financial transaction. That's what will keep my board awake at night thinking about why aren't we moving fast enough. So I didn't hear a lot of discussion on that. I assume it's because you're in total agreement.
Depends what your definition of contract is.
So truthfully, I'll let each of the panelists address that as well. I did not speak to that because it is one of the more predominant use cases. So finance, accounting, transactions, supply chain, logistics, the whole smart contracting concept. So digitizing T's and C's through the entire value chain and automating them with self-executing script, disintermediating the banks, those things. I just happen to maybe know a little bit about that, so I didn't want to maybe share too much about it with folks like you that clearly understand a lot about it, and instead I decided to speak more about other topics and use cases such as the elevator. So I don't know if you all have any comment to that, because he's absolutely correct. That is the most prevalent use case from a finance and accounting and contractual perspective.
It is, but you really have to know what your definition of smart contract is.
That's right.
To me, a contract means a lot of different things. People talk about non-repudiation, and that was something we had to kill off a long time ago, because in the end, you can't technologize intent. So you can have all the processes in the world that seem to work, the bits flip, do what you do. If I hold a gun to his head and said, sign that document or I'll shoot you, there's no intent for that contract to be fulfilled. There's no intent to enter into it. So we also have to keep in mind, again, what you said, your T's and C's. How do you define your definitions well enough to be able to trust in them?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Paul?
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think that blockchain is a very vertical thing. It's going to impact financial services. It's going to impact healthcare. It's going to impact utilities. It's going to impact them all in different ways by shortening processes and restructuring that trust model, just like we were talking about before. How it's going to do that and how quickly it's going to do that, that's why I said it's kind of scary, because some companies are going to go out of business because of blockchain. Right? It could really have a significant impact on the structure of a vertical market, like financial services, as an example. But not just financial services, other markets as well. Manufacturing, supply chains, all kinds of things are going to be impacted by this in ways we haven't even thought of yet. But it's, like I said, it can be scary, right?
Shreese, any comments?
I think probably along the same lines, and actually Paul actually brought this up as a personal experience. I ran into this scenario with SD-WAN. You explore these startups or these newer companies, products, you go to implement them and they're gobbled up.
Right.
So, and then you're in a holding pattern. So I suspect we'll get into that too with various blockchain implementations.
Mm-hmm. Any comments that you have?
Agree 100% with the statements. Because you're going to start where the most conspicuous pain points are and where you can make the biggest impact on your business. And if, depending upon the profile of the business, hell yeah, I'd start with impacting financials if you're doing a lot of global transactions. I think we're talking about it from the perspective of how it's going to impact you from a network perspective, and it's going to, I can tell you that from a service provider perspective, they've got certain internal pain points that are conspicuous and are painful, and they cost a lot of money, they create inefficiencies, and they create nightmares for customers. That's where they're going to start. I think over the long run, everybody in here who's running an enterprise network, you'll see the benefits of blockchain from the service provider perspective. It'll take some time. But if I'm running a business, I'm going to look at where my biggest pain point is. I'm probably going to start there.
All right. I think we're all set on time, or we've run out of time officially. So we'll all be available after or during the break if anyone has more questions. And thank you all for your travel out.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you.